Awesome. Hello? I think we are live. Oh, cool. So hello, everyone. For those who are joining in, we are about to start our talk with Camilla Hawthorne. I don't know if you want to give it a couple of minutes to see if people join on in. Start right away.
Okay. Well, I can start with just some general introductions to, I suppose, buy some time, if that's okay, while we're waiting for folks to come in.
Awesome.
Okay. Right. Well, thanks for that introduction. Good afternoon for you, evening for me here in Milan. And I want to thank Martine, Anita, Roxana, the rest of the Mob Poly collective for hosting this talk today. As you just heard, my name's Camilla Hawthorne, and I'm a fourth year. Actually, at this point, I suppose I'm on the cusp of my fifth year PhD student in geography at UC Berkeley. I'm also doing a designated emphasis in science and technology studies, but I'll talk a little bit more about that later. At this point, I'm currently halfway through a year of fieldwork in Italy, where I'm studying the experiences of young Black Italians, the emergence of a new form of Afro-Italian identity, and generally speaking, the cultural politics of Blackness in Italy. I do want to keep my talk this evening relatively informal. Again, I'm really grateful for this opportunity to think with all of you about my unfolding research, share some of my questions, anecdotes from the field, and some reflections on methodology. So in the spirit of a more conversational presentation, feel free to interrupt me at any time with questions, and I'll be happy to answer them to the best of my abilities. So before I start, I'll give a quick outline of my talk. I'll start with a little bit of background about myself, how I came to this project, or as an advisor once put it, the love story of how I fell in love with this project. I've always liked the way that sounds. Then I'll talk a little bit about the current situation in Italy. I'll go through my research questions, my tentative arguments, and some of the theoretical frameworks that I'm drawing on. And in the last part of the talk, I'll focus on my fieldwork practice a bit and maybe expand a bit on what I mean by a feminist fieldwork praxis. So a little bit about myself. My background is in Africana studies, international relations, and public policy or immigration policy. As an undergraduate and master's student at Brown University, I conducted research on Italy's anti-human trafficking policies, which are generally regarded in the international community at the time of my research to be an example of best practices for anti-trafficking policy. But what I found was that in practice, these anti-trafficking laws were blending into immigration control policies, and they were actually being deployed by the state really to regulate the mobility specifically of women and people of color, but under the guise of humanitarianism and protection. So from this research, I became increasingly interested in the phenomenon of African migration to Italy. So I took 2 years between finishing my master's and my PhD to work in digital media and international broadcasting. But when I started back at Berkeley for my PhD in 2012, I became interested in the growing visibility of a so-called seconda generazione, or second generation, the children of immigrants who were born or raised in Italy, a significant number of whom are Afro descendants. Now, I myself am Black and Italian. My mother is from Bergamo in Lombardy near Milan, and my father grew up in Oakland. So I personally was fascinated to see this incredible generation of people who were really around my age, working out the complexities of being both Black and Italian. They were making their voices heard, they were using the internet in really creative ways to challenge hegemonic representations of Blackness in Italy and mobilizing for their citizenship rights. And so this project was born. Just as an aside, I'm also the project manager of the Black Europe Summer School in Amsterdam, which is a 2-week program about the legacies of colonialism and slavery in Europe, anti-racist mobilizations, and citizenship for members of the Black diaspora in Europe. So these questions about what it means really to be Black in Italy and Black in Europe are things that are very, very close to my heart and really central in my life. So before jumping into the details of my project, I'll start by setting the stage, the contemporary situation in Italy. In 2011, the children of immigrants comprised nearly 10% of youth in Italy. Now the number is closer to about 20%, depending on the statistics that you use. But that year, in 2011, then President Giorgio Napolitano delivered an address to a group of newly naturalized citizens and members of the Seconda Generazione. In the most widely quoted sentence of this speech, he declared, "It is important for us to realize that young people of immigrant origins in our schools and in our society are not just an obstacle to be overcome, they are also a fruitful source of stimulation because they come from diverse cultures." At this gathering, which was conveniently timed to coincide with the 150th anniversary of Italian national unification, Napolitano proceeded to extol the ways in which the new Italian citizens seated before him would contribute to the collective well-being of Italy by sharing languages, constitutional values, civic duties, and laws, citing as some examples young Chinese entrepreneurs and the Italian Somali writer Ijaba Shego. For many activists, Napolitano's speech represented an important, yet very limited moment of institutional recognition in the growing movement to reform Italian citizenship law from a descent or blood-based system of jus sanguinis to something slightly closer to the United States' combination of jus sanguinis and birthplace-based jus soli. And for those who aren't familiar with the complexities of Italian citizenship law, essentially, if your parents had immigrated to Italy, but you were born in Italy, you're not automatically an Italian citizen. Instead, you have to wait until you turn 18, at which point you have a 1-year window, and only 1 year, in which you can apply for Italian citizenship, but you're only eligible if you've been continually resident from birth and you have basically all of the supporting documents that show that you have been continually resident in Italy from the day you were born to your 18th birthday. And there are some other requirements built in there, but that's essentially the structure of the law. It means that a lot of people are ineligible for citizenship. Either they maybe came to Italy when they were very young, or they don't have the appropriate documentation, or they missed their 1-year window. So there's essentially an entire generation of people in Italy who are disenfranchised. But back to this 2011 story, at a time of economic crisis and declining Italian birth rates, Napolitano's speech implied that it is simply good business to bring the children of immigrants into the Italian fold. Indeed, they might prove to be more active and productive citizens than their unproductive Italian counterparts. So to that effect, there's a moderate jus soli bill that's currently being debated in the Senate, the Italian Senate, and if it's passed, it would provide a path to citizenship for around 800,000 minori stranieri, or children of immigrants, who were born or raised in Italy. But currently, this bill is being blocked in the Senate by right-wing obstructionist tactics. Specifically, the last time I checked, they had added about 8,000 senseless amendments to the bill just to slow its progress through the legislature. But this moment signaled a profound contradiction in contemporary Italy, one that has only grown more apparent within the last year. As we know, Italy, along with the rest of Southern Europe, is embroiled in what analysts have described as the worst refugee crisis since World War II. During the summer of 2015, the Mediterranean was designated the most deadly sea in the world and the most deadly border in the world, and 2016 doesn't look any better. So what I'm trying to figure out is how we can make sense of this interplay of exclusion and inclusion in Italy today, of these preliminary overtures toward putative inclusion alongside such a deadly hardening of borders. Because it seems like we're seeing what geographer Heather Merrill has described as the contradictory racialization of African Italos and their simultaneous invisibility and the centrality of their participation in Italian life. Both the refugee crisis and the citizenship reform movement are occurring within the context of an Italy that is popularly understood to be in a state of crisis. This is a crisis that envelops its precarious integrity as a nation state, but also its precarious inclusion within Europe. Debates about refugees and the so-called second generation are articulating discourses of economic stagnation, declining Italian birth rates, the brain drain of highly educated Italians and the supposed problem of diversity into this overarching declensionist narrative about the challenges of making Italians today. Now, common sense logic suggests that this sense of crisis as a vernacular category this crisis is deterministically generating a hardening of Italy's material and symbolic borders. That's true, but it's only part of the story. The overwhelming uncertainty about the future of Italy has also created an opening, not just for an explosion of violent ethno-nationalisms, which we are absolutely seeing, and it's terrifying, but it's also created an opening for challenges to the bounded nation. So the omnipresent figure of crisis is tied not just to a multiplication of labor, as Brett Nielsen and Sandro Mezzadra have argued, but also to a multiplication of modes of citizenship and belonging in contemporary Italy. It's produced a limited sort of opening, an impetus for creatively reimagining what the future of Italy and Europe could be. So if we look closely, we can see a proliferation of expressions of Italianness, many deeply ambiguous, admittedly, and sometimes drawing on older forms of racialization, but that are being generated by a wide range of actors, all because of this sense of crisis and uncertainty about the future. And just a quick aside, Brexit in particular has brought to light the fundamentally racial character of citizenship, if there was ever any doubt about this. Shortly after the vote was announced, Italian Prime Minister Renzi declared that he would seek to give citizenship or long-term residency permits, the details are a bit murky, to British students in Italy. Now, the shock of this announcement reverberated through the Black Italian community, who could not believe that the government would move so quickly to accommodate British students in Italy while the citizenship reform bill continues to languish in the Italian legislature. In addition, an article was recently published on a prominent Italian website of social commentary with the title, Brexit, they write Europe, but they mean the N-word. Now, the author's argument was that in the Leave campaign, Europe's impurities were materialized in the figure of the dirty black. This article sparked a backlash among Black Italians because it treated Blackness as little more than a metaphor for everything that is undesirable, without actually considering the impact of Brexit on actually living, existing Black Europeans and Black Brits. Even if, as the author of that article wrote, Europe was symbolized by an unwanted Blackness, the article still shows that when politicians and commentators are talking about European citizenship, they really have a very specific race and gendered subject in mind. But going back to my project, the centrality of the refugee crisis in Italy raises the question of what can be specifically disclosed by studying Italian-born Black youth, especially when the arrival of refugees has produced a renewed invisibilization of seconda generazione youth politics. I'm often asked, Camilla, why aren't you doing your research on refugees? Clearly, the interactions between refugee mobilizations and citizenship reform movements are of great interest, and these stories are profoundly interconnected in ways that I explore in my research. But I want to argue that by focusing on the children of African immigrants who were born or raised in Italy, we can actually begin to tell a different sort of story in which Italy and Europe is being actively remade through the everyday activities of people, groups who inhabit the physical and symbolic border spaces of Italy and Europe. Italian-born and raised youth are simultaneously incorporated into new nationalist projects, but they're also excluded from multiple forms of belonging. Just as they are selectively marshaled in some circles as the face of a new Italy, or the face of a new country, new forms of racial differentiation are also emerging. Though they are frequently characterized as invisible, tragically and hopelessly caught between two worlds, the children of African immigrants in Italy are actively involved in the ambiguous process not only of producing an emergent Black Italy, but also of producing Italy itself. Their complex articulations of diasporic resources with local knowledge are actively challenging the formal and everyday boundaries that demarcate belonging in Italy. And their mobilizations, the ways that they articulate the relationship between Blackness and Italianness, are going to have really long-lasting consequences for people who are currently arriving to Italy as migrants and refugees. Another way of saying this is that I'm focusing on the children of African immigrants because, as evidenced by the shocking and widely publicized scenes such as the racist taunting of footballer Mario Balotelli, who was born in Italy to Ghanaian parents and is perhaps the most widely recognized Black Italian, or the bananas thrown at former Italian Minister of Integration Cecile Kyenge, who is from the Democratic Republic of the Congo and was a key advocate for citizenship reform, Black bodies both mark and bear the brunt of racialized citizenship in Italy. Indeed, as a Nigerian activist confided in me a couple years ago, she said, it's not just about immigration status, it's also about race. The Black race is worse off in Italy because we stand out. So my dissertation is exploring the various ways in which the children of African immigrants in Italy are laying claim to Italianness in this seemingly paradoxical context of both the growing Italian citizenship reform movement and this ongoing Southern European refugee crisis. What new formations are possible, and what older ones are resuscitated in the attempt to challenge the borders of Italy. I'm exploring the conditions of this new visibility, the consequences of linking Italian belonging to legal citizenship and the state, and these alternative articulations of belonging beyond the institutions of state recognition. Now, over the past 6 months, projects change, things become clearer, new themes emerge. And what I've realized is that my project fundamentally is about how a Black diasporic community can form, survive, and thrive when the exclusionary logics of Fortress Europe would have us believe that it shouldn't exist in the first place. This is important because in Europe, Blackness has come to be synonymous with death. Whether activists on the left are invoking images of Black refugees drowning in the Mediterranean, or right-wing xenophobes are implying that an encroaching Blackness marks the impending death of a racially pure Europe that never actually existed. This question of change and adaptation as necessary for survival leads me to my second argument. Specifically, that Black Italians who were born and raised in Italy have become complicit in the ambiguous process of congealing Italianness in ways that are going to be enormously consequential for the future. In other words, in the process of seeking to be legitimized as Italian, they must first define what it means to be Italian. And this is something that, essentially, as I often say, Italianness has always been an open question. It's always been up for grabs. It's been under contestation since the tentative unification of Italy at the end of the 19th century. Several people who I've interviewed, in fact, lament the fact that, especially in the context of the citizenship reform movement, they feel pressured by society at large to wave the Italian flag, that they're being conscripted into these nationalist projects of defining and then representing Italianness. So even as they are pushing the boundaries for who counts as Italian, they're still working in a paradoxical way to stabilize the representations and practices of Italianness. Now, this relates to the point that I made earlier about the multi-pronged crisis in Italy as a phenomenon that has created both openings and closures, wherein some groups on the margins of Italianness are selectively incorporated, but always at the expense of the further marginalization of others. So then the question becomes, what practices and embodiments and geographies of Blackness can be incorporated at this moment, rather than what it means to be Black Italian in an abstract or generalized sense? What I found is that while the experience of anti-Blackness is undoubtedly central to the lives and everyday practices and experiences of Black youth in Italy, it's also sufficient to say that the boundaries of Italianness have only hardened at this moment of crisis. Rather, as Italy faces the specter of inundation in scare quotes, of course, by newly arriving refugees and declining birth rates and brain drain, all these things that I mentioned earlier, the supposedly bright line that's dividing Black from Italian is being supplanted with a new set of racialized distinctions. These new distinctions prioritize nativity, that would be birthplace in Italy, cultural fluency, and what I'm calling diasporic flexibility. Birthplace and a shared cultural milieu have produced new bonds of affinity rather than identity among differently racialized youth in Italy, much like the adoption of the interethnic category of immigrants by an early generation of arrivals from Africa, the Middle East, Latin America, and Southeast Asia. Markers of cultural fluency and economic productivity, which are displayed prominently on a burgeoning group of internet sites and social media pages promoting positive images of young Black Italians, also serve to distinguish certain youth from risky or unassimilable subjects such as school dropouts, the unemployed, or even the incarcerated. And of course, this process is profoundly gendered, tied as it is to the challenge of producing or reproducing Italy. And so Black women in particular bear the brunt of representing, either in alarmist or idealist tones, this new Italy. So to carry out this project, I'm relying on several key theoretical frameworks, but today, for the sake of time in my talk, I'll focus on two. The first is Black European studies, and second is this question of race, space, and geography. Black European studies deals with the question of how one begins to rethink Europe from the vantage point of Blackness and the geographies of slavery, colonialism, and imperialism. From this perspective, post-colonial migrations can no longer be characterized as foreign intrusions into bounded European space. Rather, as the famous chant of post-colonial migrants in Britain goes, "We are here because you were there." This is important because current analyses of the refugee crisis currently approach Italy as a bounded unit, committing a form of methodological nationalism that takes for granted the country's borders and the multiple forms of violence they wage. Even critical interventions that challenge the arbitrary distinction between refugees and migrants don't go far enough. They continue to apply that difference is external to Italy, embodied by the figure of the geographically mobile or displaced subject. This is what I call the paradigm of immigration and integration. And I'm suggesting that it doesn't fully capture the complexity of the contestations around the meanings and practices of Italianness at this conjuncture. Again, the case of second-generation Black youth in Italy, a group to whom the immigration-integration paradigm does not so neatly apply, demonstrates that difference, whether this is racial, cultural, or other kinds of difference, can never be bounded as exogenous to the Italian nation. Just a quick note here. In Italy, it's common to hear things like, racism didn't exist until it was imposed by the Nazis in World War II, or when large numbers of African immigrants began to arrive in the 1990s. The assumption here is that race and racism are embodied in the figure of the Black migrant, are carried basically on the backs of Black bodies who are entering into pure Italian space. And this really problematic line of argument really only helps to bolster the myth of Italiani brava gente, or Italians good people. You know, Italians good people who didn't really colonize that severely and who really don't have it within them to be racist. So going back to my point, the second generation doesn't fit within the institutional categories by which difference is legally managed in Italy. The immigrant, the refugee, the victim of trafficking, as evidenced by their uneasy incorporation within official integration programs. So Black European studies as a theoretical framework allows me to get past this bounding of Blackness as forever external to the Italian nation, or as forever external to Europe, as something that's only induced by migration rather than these intertwined histories of colonialism and imperialism. And so building on these insights from Black European studies, I'm also drawing on some emerging, really interesting scholarship on the Black Mediterranean, which gets at the specific histories of racism and race-making in the Mediterranean basin, which are historical and geographical processes that are distinct from the Black Atlantic, but also profoundly interconnected with sort of Black Atlantic geographies of Blackness and diaspora. And the second theoretical framework that I'll sort of expand on this afternoon is that of race and geography. So the discipline of geography, going back to at least the Enlightenment, is so profoundly intertwined with racial theories that we're still contending with today. But as geographies of color, such as Laura Polito and Audrey Kobayashi have argued, contemporary geography tends to really marginalize the study of race as kind of maybe the dirty underbelly of geography's, imperial history. Now, fortunately, thanks to the incredible work by multiple generations of Black geographers, this is beginning to change in sort of what counts as disciplinary geography. But in the case of Italy, really, I mean, disciplinary geography was central in the articulation of racialized Italian nationhood, and the charting of racial differences between Northern Italians and Southern Italians, and sort of imperial projects of cartography of mapping Italy's colonial holdings in Africa. So geography is really central to this story in all sorts of ways. But specifically, at this moment, when biological understandings of race have fallen out of official favor in Italy, and center-left advocates advocate post-racialism and colorblindness, and right-wing separatists are couching their xenophobia in the acceptable language of cultural difference, a geographical and historically situated understanding of race and racism is absolutely essential. In other words, a geographical understanding of race provides an analytical toolkit for identifying forms of racial differentiation that don't explicitly invoke blood, but nonetheless employ essentializing logics. The rise of so-called cultural racisms across Europe, along with a proliferation of new technologies for reinscribing race and racial categories, makes it clear that race is not and never has been solely contained within the individual body or inscribed on the surface of the skin. Race is also a matter of geographical location and movement through space. And of course, by extension, that means that racial violence is simultaneously spatial violence. This approach begins to elucidate why, for instance, cosmopolitan inflected, or some might say, and I'm a bit unsure about this term, but some might call it Afropolitan articulations of Blackness and birthright citizenship claims might tentatively coexist in Italy along with the marginalization of newly arrived refugees from sub-Saharan Africa. And that's because each of these, say, practices or representations of Blackness charts different kinds of relationships among space, place, mobility, diaspora, and status. And just a quick note, and I'm happy to expand on this later if there's time and we have questions, I'm also very interested in the politics of digital media in this project. The emergence of a new seconda generazione, second generation, and Black Italian cultural politics is deeply intertwined with the internet and social media, which allowed young people in Italy to form sprawling online networks for sharing common experiences and political strategies. These young people have turned to the internet to find social relations and forge networks of solidarity that were lacking in their relatively homogeneous and spatially dispersed Italian hometowns. Because, spatial dispersion is really one of the challenges facing many young Black Italians. Unlike countries like France, where there's sort of spatial segregation of Black communities into urban peripheries, that kind of spatial phenomenon doesn't exist quite to the same extent in Italy. So one of the challenges that many of my interlocutors have expressed to me is really a sense of, well, being geographically scattered across Italy. And so the internet has really been central, not in a deterministic way, but it has sort of facilitated the formation of new kinds of networks. To the extent that even some, let's say, older Afro-Italians who are, say, in their maybe mid to late 30s, early 40s, say that that's one of the main things that distinguishes their generation from sort of the new cohort of Black Italians that's coming up right now, that access to the internet has allowed for a new kind of expression, has created a space, really, an incredible space for discussions around what it means to be Black, about the politics of Black hair. So I'm very interested in the relationship between the internet and the articulation of racial or diasporic identities, even the remixing of diasporic resources from the United States, from France, the UK, and the ways that these images and practices and symbols from Black liberatory struggles elsewhere get territorialized in Italy. So in that sense, I'm following in a line of researchers who've challenged earlier techno-utopian predictions that race would entirely cease to exist on the internet. Rather, what we're seeing in Italy is that these processes of identity formation and of representations of race and racial subjectivities are being sort of transformed and working in relation with technologies such as social media and the internet. If there are any questions about this, I'm happy to expand on this more later. So now I'll transition to the last part of my talk, which is about my fieldwork practice, sort sort of ethics of fieldwork methodology. So, inspired by the work of Black feminist geographers like Catherine McKittrick and Ruth Wilson Gilmore, my project begins from an understanding that Black life is inherently and profoundly geographical. The hegemonic whiteness of geography as a discipline tends to either ignore Black geographic praxis or treats Black folk as little more than victims of geography. Now, I'm trying to assert through my work that centering and indeed loving the resilience of Black life is itself a form of Black feminist praxis. And this is how I, in my work, am trying to resist the pernicious logic of Fortress Europe, which declares that Black Italians do not and should not exist. In particular, I'm deeply inspired by the work of Black women in Italy. As scholars from Angela Davis to Gloria Becker have noted recently, we're seeing around the world a proliferation of new social movements that are led by Black women, and Italy is no different in that regard. This is especially important given the ways that racism really works through gender and sexuality in Italy. With, again, the demographic crisis, what's perceived, let's say, by the Italian state as a demographic crisis, and a decline in Italian birth rates, concerns about what it means to reproduce the Italian nation bring together race and gender in ways that specifically oppress Black women, and the ways that Black Italian youth are resisting these discourses is quite fascinating and really inspiring. In addition, in sort of the spirit of feminist fieldwork practice, I see myself as very much situated in this research. And this is something that I try to center in my analysis rather than something that I sideline or write off with a couple sentences of disclaimer. Okay, I've situated myself, now let's move on to the real serious stuff, the real serious objective stuff, right? In this kind of masculinist tradition of the objective researcher, the view from nowhere. So my research is really driven by a set of commitments that are both political and deeply intimate, not that those two could ever be fully separated. The question of whether it's possible to be simultaneously Black and Italian is one that's very close to my heart. And for me, the project of linking the Black diaspora to Italy with the understanding that just as Black Italians inhabit the margins of Europe, Black Italians inhabit one of the margins of the Black diaspora, rather Italy itself inhabits, you could say, the margins of Europe. This process of linking the Black diaspora to Italy is tied up with a personal endeavor to chart the tensions of my own familial roots and routes. But even though I recognize my own situatedness in this research that I'm conducting, I'm always hesitant to project myself onto my interlocutors in Italy. After all, on just the most basic and straightforward level, the same jus sanguinis citizenship law that restricts access to Italian citizenship to the Italian-born children of African immigrants in Italy is precisely what allows me to enjoy dual US-Italian citizenship, despite having been born in California. I inherited citizenship through my mother. So, as I often say, I'm a Black Italian by a different set of roots and routes. So, given the multiplicity and variegation of Blackness in Italy, my work requires an understanding of diaspora as a relation of power and not just a utopian invocation of sameness. And of course, as a scholar based at a relatively well-known, even in Italy, institution of higher learning in the United States, carrying 2 passports and relying on the unspoken benefits of American privilege, which adhere to me in ways that I may not want, but I'm profoundly cognizant of the networks of power that infuse my ability to conduct research in Italy. But of course, I'm also trying to really draw out these ambiguities during my research, as in fact do my interlocutors, who are always eager to compare Italian identity politics to their stateside counterparts in dialogical exchanges of what Tina Kemp has called intercultural address. So these fascinating moments during fieldwork where I'm varyingly read as Black American, as Italian, as mixed, or as something else entirely, and I'll share the something else entirely later. These moments can reveal a great deal about the fraught and contradictory ways that language, birthplace, phenotype, popular culture consumption, and myriad other factors get assembled into particular historically and geographically situated interpretations of identity and allegiance. So this dialectic of closeness and distance is something that I draw on in my research, and it's something that I've been experimenting with in various sorts of extended dialogical interview techniques, where my goal is to draw out the similarities and differences in our experiences. These differences could be geographical, growing up in different spaces, and also temporal, growing up in different times. I mean, funnily enough, in the case of younger people I interview, I remember in Italy from the late 80s or early 90s that they don't remember, or maybe weren't born in time to see. So we even have memories of different kinds of Italy, different experiences of Italy. And then draw out those similarities and differences and use them as sort of the ground from which to begin theorizing. And, indeed, even during interviews, I have experiences of my own to share. And I think these experiences, these moments of racial misrecognition or misidentification, which which my interlocutors and I think through in the course of interviews to really tease apart these questions of, what race and racism mean in Italy, what particular articulations of race and racism we're seeing in contemporary Italy today. And I'll share some of these stories with you now because I think they're funny, and I think they're also they elucidate a lot about the current situation in Italy. The first actually comes from the title of this talk, Ma com'è che parli così bene l'italiano? Which translates to, but how is it that you speak Italian so well? And it's inevitably spoken in that same kind of sing-songy but condescending tone. This is something that I hear at least once a week from shopkeepers, from acquaintances, when I go into stores, from all sorts of people at conferences, even, surrounded by academics. I began actually taking note in my field notes of every time when someone asked me how it is that I speak Italian so well, because it says so much about how one is read and sort of the stubborn impossibility of imagining someone who doesn't present as a white Italian to actually be Italian. And of course, this is interesting and paradoxical because Italians often like to showcase a history of Mediterranean mixing as evidence that Italy isn't racist, or that Italians themselves have no racial identity. This could be through invocations of Italy as a great civilizational crossroads in the Mediterranean. It could be because they're sort of cognizant of the history of racializing Southern Italians as racially closer to Africans. But, of course, the problem is that while it might be true, and obviously there's no racially pure nation, we understand this, but the problem with this sort of claim to Italian mixedness of meticciato is that it absolves Italians of responsibility for racism and also allows Italians to deny the hegemony of whiteness, the same hegemony of whiteness that allows someone to walk up to me and ask me, ma come che parli così bene l'italiano? Even though I'd been speaking Italian, was actually the first language that I spoke. Another story of racial misrecognition. I actually live outside of Milan in a small working class town called Sesto San Giovanni, which is really a suburb of Milan connected to the city by train, by metro. And in the evenings, I like to go swimming at the community pool with my cousin. And I'm an amateur triathlete, and I have a swim cap proudly emblazoned with the words Oakland Triathlon on the side. So I get into the pool and I'm, about to start swimming my laps, and the swim coach walks over to me and very curiously looks at me and says, "Oh, so you're from New Zealand?" And I said, "No, I'm Italian. I live in Italy. My home is in California." And he said, "Oh, well, I saw from your cap it says Auckland. So, your cap says Auckland, and I see that you're mulatta, so I assume that you must be from New Zealand." Now, obviously, there's so much wrong with this story. Obviously, the misreading of Oakland to Auckland, the use of the term mulatta, which is quite common in Italy, for better or worse, and the sort of assumption, again, that being a person of color, that being non-white, that being, let's say, racially mixed in that way, automatically means that you are not coming from Italy, but that you come from some faraway, quote-unquote, exotic place where difference happens. The assumption, again, being that that difference doesn't happen within Italy. And just one final story, because I do want to leave time for questions. Actually, in March, I was flying home from Milan to San Francisco for a conference, and I was checking in at the check-in counter at Malpensa Airport, and the woman asked for my documents, and I showed her my Italian passport, because when I'm in Europe, I use my Italian passport. And she proceeded to interrogate me about why I had an Italian passport. And every time I tried to give an answer, my answer wasn't enough. Now, this was 2 days after the attack in Brussels. So, why do you have an Italian passport? Well, because I'm an Italian citizen. Why do you have Italian citizenship? Well, my mom is Italian. Where's your residence? Well, my residence is in California, but I live in Italy. Well, then I don't understand how you could be an Italian citizenship. And so this goes on and on and on until finally I say, I think I've made this clear enough. I don't understand why you keep asking me these questions. And her response very sternly, and remember, this was not in customs. This was just to check in for my flight. She said, I can ask you whatever questions I want for matters of security. So, again, this goes back to this question of, really for me, what it means to live the practice of fieldwork on the surface of my skin. The reality of being someone who's essentially studying the interplay of race and citizenship in Italy, and being racially profiled at an airport in Italy because I'm traveling on an Italian passport. So, again, these are all anecdotes that I see as very much part of my fieldwork practice that, provide contradictorily a lot of really rich material for me to think through, although at the same time, sometimes I tell myself, I have enough anecdotes to fill a dissertation. I wish that they would just treat me like a human at this point. But of course, what I experience, again, going back to the similarities and differences, what I experience is only a fraction of what my interlocutors in Italy have lived for their entire lives. So, again, teasing out these similarities and differences through dialogical interview practices and situating myself within this story as a Black Italian who's actively trying to sort out questions that are a matter of deeply personal importance, but also of great political significance. All of these things kind of come together in what I'm calling my feminist fieldwork praxis. So in terms of the nitty-gritty of this fieldwork that I'm carrying out, I'm conducting interviews with artists, with activists, and entrepreneurs across Northern Italy, because those are really the spaces where geographical areas where Black Italians are primarily located. And in addition, I'm conducting participant observation at events related to the themes of my project. These could be activist meetings, book presentations, Black hair meetups. I'm very interested in the embodied practices and representations of Blackness and Italianness. So these could be things like accent, style of dress, entrepreneurial activity. So kind of moving beyond just sort of discourse in terms of the spoken word, but to think about kind of bodily practices, embodied practices. You could call my group of interlocutors really a loosely defined and emergent collective of activists, artists, and entrepreneurs. That what I'm studying is really a new kind of organizing that doesn't conform to the more traditional Italian model of immigrant associations or cultural centers or labor unions. So these geographically scattered individuals come together in rather ephemeral and constantly reassembled networks that materialize through specific projects, events, or controversies. And I've also become involved in various cultural and activist projects. I'm attempting to embrace a form of reciprocity in my research. Too often it feels as though fieldwork is a purely extractive process where the researcher flies in, takes information, and then leaves. Instead, I'm trying to see this research as a process of mutual discovery. And in fact, I've had many interlocutors tell me that these interviews, these conversations actually help them sort out their own ideas and think through new ideas. Since most people that I speak to have said that it's really only in the last couple of years that they've really begun to think in any systematic way about this idea of Afro-Italianness. It's a very new and emergent concept. I'm also writing in the public sphere in English and Italian, and I speak publicly about my work. The point here is to ensure that I'm not hoarding my information, but putting it to work in the Italian context, because I'm deeply invested in the transformation of Italian society and in these anti-racist projects. And finally, I'm also attempting to facilitate connections between this emergent group of Black Italian activists with the broader Black European networks that I'm a part of. And I'm also inviting people to speak at these same events on their experiences, so that they're not always being spoken for by academics, but speaking for themselves, because they are really the experts of their own experiences. So I'll stop there and open it to questions if there are any. Thank you again for giving me this space to talk about my project.
No, thank you, Camilla. Thank you so much for that. That was amazing. I am currently looking at the question and answer sections that we have. I don't see any on Twitter or on Facebook, but I did personally have some questions. So you were mentioning about how, compared to France, the Afro-Italians they're more spread out than they are in France. Do you see this, or does the Afro-Italian community see this as a more beneficial thing, that they're not as close together? Because I don't know. What have you found, and what did they think?
Yeah, it's complicated, and it's, the phenomenon is perhaps a bit more complicated than than a sort of black and white, France is like this and Italy is like this. There obviously are, enclaves, sort of Black community enclaves in particular cities, Brescia being one example, or, in Milan, there's a neighborhood called Porta Venezia that's home to a multi-generational Eritrean community. And, many cities like Padova have communities where you could say, the Black African immigrant community is more concentrated. But I would say comparative, so there are still kind of processes of spatial segregation at work. And I think, the question is, the extent to which this will be accelerated or not with sort of the refugee crisis. That's kind of an open question. But I think you could make the argument that compared to France, we're not, Italy doesn't have banlieues in the way that, that say the suburbs of Paris have. Now, the people I've interviewed have very mixed feelings about this. On the one hand, as I said, this question of sort of being geographically scattered is something that people always bring up as sort of a challenge, something that's maybe stymied the formation of kind of a coherent kind of Black Italian political movement. It's why, a lot of people center the internet in their stories about sort of how they came to a certain kind of Black consciousness, because they had access to conversations that, maybe they didn't have growing up. At the same time, I've actually, ironically heard people say that that maybe in a bizarre way, it could also be a good thing. So there's a, one line that I hear, and this goes back to this idea of, there's sort of this kind of contradictory moment of kind of being open to possibility in Italy right now, in part because sort of the large scale immigration to Italy happened comparatively later than it did in countries like, well, obviously the United States, but, France and the UK. That, many people have said, look, we actually have this opportunity to create a different sort of model, to actually learn from the mistakes of France, to learn from the mistakes of the United States, and really through kind of coherent organizing and making our voices heard, to actually create a different kind of model for being Black in Italy that maybe avoids some of the problems that other countries have faced. So those, again, speaking from what my interlocutors have told me, those are kind of the two sides of the spatial dispersion that people have.
Oh, my God. And so we have a question from Twitter from Calvin from UCLA. He would like to know is if your work is received differently in North America versus in Italy and Europe, and in those classes that you give, how is your work received?
Oh, that's really interesting. Actually, one of the most interesting things that I found is that, So I'll say that my work has been received positively on, let's say, both sides of the Atlantic, but the types of questions that I receive are quite different. I think in many ways, Black Italians are both invisibilized, but they're also hypervisible in the sense that they're also kind of criminalized, and sort of a lot of attention is kind of placed on them as the future of Italy, for better or worse, depending on the side of the political spectrum you're on. But in the U.S., there's not as much knowledge about the fact that we're now entering the second and third generation of Black Italians in Italy. I think when we think of what filters into the U.S. through mass media, it's really representations of refugees, of migrants, arriving by boat to Lampedusa, and so people are very one, like I said, I often get this question, where are the refugees in your story? Are you doing your research on refugees? You must be studying the migrant crisis. Or people will say, oh, I didn't realize that there were actually Black people who were born in Italy. In Italy, on the other hand, it's funny because I actually, especially with with young Black Italians with whom I'm very open about sharing my work, as I work on it and testing out ideas. And it's interesting because from that community, I've actually never gotten the question about why not, why aren't you doing research on the refugee question? And I think for them it's because, and this is actually like a very complicated issue and something that I'm thinking through in my research. But what I'll say is that I think for them, as they're actively trying to make space for themselves and gain recognition as Italians, many people have said that the refugee crisis has added a sense of urgency to their struggles because it's created what what Chimamanda Adichie has called a single story of Blackness in Italy, as poor, as destitute, as desperate. And so for them, they are interested in telling their stories as Black Italians, as people who were born in Italy, raised in Italy, understand themselves as Italian, speak Italian, but obviously also draw on the resources of their parents' home countries, the broader Black diaspora. So in that sense, my work has been very well received, and actually a friend of mine and someone who I met through this research jokingly told me, look, you have to title your dissertation "Changing the Representations of Black People in Italy," because what you're doing is really just that. Now, what I will say, and this is what I was getting at when I said that it's complicated, is that the refugee, what I'll call the refugee story and the Black Italian story are fundamentally intertwined in the sense that they're both kind of part of this conjunctural moment, but in a lot of ways they're being held separate, kind of on parallel tracks, both in kind of policy discourse, but also by by many people who are kind of involved in these struggles. And sometimes that's done explicitly, and sometimes it's done implicitly. There have been, I've had people say things, like, especially in the context of citizenship reform, for instance, that who are grappling with this sort of this contradiction by which they see themselves as focused on citizenship reform, but are also very much aware of the fact that these mobilizations in Italy can't just end with citizenship, that there's sort of this ambiguous process by which, providing citizenship for some, say, seconda generazione Black Italians, kind of might further marginalize people who are newly arrived, and that their mobilizations in Italy to gain recognition as Black Italians is going to have these profound repercussions for people who will be coming to Italy now and perhaps settling and having children. So, people are aware of I suppose, in a sense, the political expediency of saying, look, the refugee crisis is one thing, but we're not refugees, we're Italian. There's a political expediency to making that kind of distinction, but at the same time, it's a contradiction that people are grappling with every day. I hope that makes sense.
Sorry, my computer's freezing up a little bit. Yeah, so I'm getting this like the disconnect between acceptance, because as you say, the Afro-Italian community is saying, no, I'm not a refugee citizen, but the Italians don't don't understand how they can be mulatto and speaking Italian, like as you're previous working on. So that's very insightful. We
Oh,
have
actually,
another question.
if I could just add one thing to that last point, I just want to make a plug. There's a fantastic documentary called Asmarina by an Italian Eritrean filmmaker named Nadine Paulos, who is also one of the founding members of the Refugee, which is the activist organization that has been carrying forward the citizenship reform movement in Italy. And one of the things that I think is so brilliant about the documentary is that in the latter half, she actually looks at the way, because one of the things that sort of gets lost in the media representation of the refugee crisis is that one of the largest groups of people entering Italy are Eritreans, and Milan has a really large and well-established Eritrean community. So her documentary gets at the relationship between this long-standing Eritrean community and how they're sort of entering into solidarity with newly arrived refugees, because they speak the same languages, they're able to provide food and medical assistance and translation. So again, I also don't want to overstate how separate these things are, because there are these everyday political practices that draw together second generation Black Italians and people who are newly arrived as well.
I'm going to share that the little tidbit of information. I'll ask for you to clarify the names completely later on, so we can share it with our members. But on Facebook, we have a question saying, what is the potential relevance of Black Italians living in the north and not in the south of Italy, considering that the north is usually known for being the rich part of Italy, poor one? Ethnic/racial distribution may say in terms of the political economy of Italy. And it goes into a second part saying, by the way, the notion of Afro-nationality has been also recently explored among the other nationalities, such as Afro-Mexicans in the United States and in Mexico or other Latin American countries. Alejandro. Hello, Alejandro.
That's actually fascinating. I'll have to look into some of this work on Afro nationality. That's really fascinating, because precisely what I'm finding in my work is that these sort of diasporic linkages are being leveraged not in spite of, but sort of in the service of these projects of national recognition. So there's this interesting articulation of diasporic resources, of kind of Black diasporic consciousness, with these claims that are tied to the specific Italian context. So to the north-south divide in Italy, again, this isn't to say that there are not Black Italians in southern Italy, because there are, but I would say that sort of, statistically speaking, Black Italians are primarily clustered in, the wealthy industrial areas of the north and also Rome. Now, there's a whole other story here about African migrant workers working in the agricultural sector in southern Italy. You might have heard about the Rosarno riots and sort of, undocumented labor and sort of its ties to the mafia. That's a whole other and really fascinating story. And there are people from Timothy Ramakers to it's Federico Oliveri, who are doing work on migrant activism in those spaces. But to this point about the north-south, and also, there are Black Italian activist groups who are working in places around Naples as well. But, I would say most of this action is really happening in the north. Now this is interesting on a lot of levels, including the fact that it's in northern Italy, where you see, parties like the Lega Nord, so, these right-wing ethno-nationalist political parties. It's also interesting because there's a long history of labor migration from southern Italy to northern Italy, especially post-World War II, where you had, labor migrants from the poorer southern part of Italy who were coming to northern Italy, particularly around Turin. And geographer Heather Merrill has written about this in search of labor. And actually in the community where I live, Sesto San Giovanni, also has a rich history of southern labor migrants coming here to work in the factories. This used to be a factory city. And They were, discriminated against. People would not give them housing. Some of the same racial slurs that are actually used against Black African migrants in Italy were being used against those Southern Italian labor migrants, 50 some odd years ago. That being said, what's interesting about sort of the preponderance of Black Italians in Northern Italy, and this is another part of my project, is the way in which entrepreneurship has become one of the many spaces in which Black Italians are attempting to make themselves known and legitimate their presence, and show that rather than being, because, again, right now in the context of the refugee crisis, Blackness has come to be seen as a drain on welfare, right? This is something that David Thiel Goldberg writes about in The Threat of Race. So what's happening is that you have this generation of young Black Italians and a lot of Black Italian women who are starting these entrepreneurial projects related to, say, Black hair or Afro fashion or, music, record labels that are, let's say, turning the idea of made in Italy on its head, right? The sort of the famous made in Italy brand that's supposed to stand for quality and craftsmanship, but that sort of entered into crisis because of the economic downturn, and frankly, also because of, sort of racialized fears of, transnational business partnerships with China and Chinese immigrants. They're taking this idea of made in Italy, turning it on its head and saying, we might be Black, but we're Italian, and we're going to revitalize made in Italy, infusing it with a kind of cosmopolitan, multicultural, like I said, I don't like this word, but, Afropolitan flair. Right? So that's been one of really the most, a really fascinating place where these conversations about Blackness in Italy are sort of congealing. It's in the space of entrepreneurship. And of course, this raises all sorts of really complicated questions because, again, as a political strategy, right, this makes sense, but it raises these complicated questions about, what does it mean to sort of link one's political recognition to the market? What happens to people who aren't able to sort of mobilize economic resources in the same way, and so on.
Okay, very interesting. And you find that this whole brand, like you said, the Made in Italy idea that has been installed now through the economic country has gone through / getting back on track, it's being revitalized and it's being accepted, all these new forms of entrepreneurship, or is there still hesitation? Yeah. Is there still hesitation in the public?
It's, it's very contradictory. And this goes back to the point I made earlier about Black Italians on the one hand being sort of marshaled as the face of a new Italy, but also being sort of detracted as kind of a threat to real Italians, right? So, many of these entrepreneurs have achieved like an incredible degree of prominence, featured in documentaries, being interviewed by the press, being invited to speak about what they're doing, and sort of really, really lauded for what they're doing. And then, obviously at the same time, there are detractors who say, look, you're in Italy, you want to be Italian, then say you're Italian and drop the Afro thing, drop the Black thing. And, I think part of it also kind of ties into, particularly with Italy, there's this complicated history of a kind of intimacy with Blackness that I think kind of dates back to colonialism, where, Italians have a let's say Italian popular culture has sort of a love or a fascination for all things Black that really borders on sort of the like fetishization. I'm not saying that this is a positive thing. It also is another thing that gets marshaled, to say we're not racist. We love Black women. We love Black American soul music. And I think that it's this kind of dialectic of sort of intimacy and violence that also speaks to the mixed way in which these new projects are being received, right? There's a fascination with this new generation of Black Italians, and also a bit of hesitation. But I have to say, I mean, as a scholar and as a Black Italian woman, these projects are amazing, and some of these, these entrepreneurs are incredibly creative and are very, they're very, for all the critiques that I have of sort of capitalism and sort of the market, the market as salvation, they have very sharp critiques of, Italian racism, and are very explicit about the way that what they're doing is not just, it's not just capital accumulation, it's not just about profits, but it's really about kind of blending together kind of Black consciousness and, trying to change the perceptions of the society at large through essentially a medium that is easily accessible to people. And in the case of Italy, right, beauty, fashion, music, popular culture.
Very interesting. And I don't know if we got from your presentation earlier about your interlocutors. Where or like how do you get connected with your subjects that you interview?
Yeah, it's been I've been, if you count sort of the work that I did in my undergrad and master's, I've been doing research in and about Italy since about 2008. So it's been a long time. When I started my PhD, I actually went back to some of the people who I had interviewed from my research on trafficking. So people, activists, people working in NGOs, and migration scholars. And then from there, I think, I've done, so this year, and I don't remember if I mentioned this, but I'm in Italy for sort of a full calendar year doing this ethnographic fieldwork, but I've made 2 previous pre-dissertation fieldwork trips during the summer of 2013 and 2014. And on those trips, that's when I kind of made my first contacts. In part, it was through, being introduced to professors who were working in Italy, who then put me in touch with, activists and community workers who they knew. A lot of people I actually met through the internet. I mean, one of the inspirations for this project was coming across this whole world of Afro-Italian, Black Italian blogs and discussion groups and forums. I said, where was this when I was growing up? It was fascinating to see all these people who are working out what it means to be Black and Italian in a world that tells you have to pick one or the other. So I started contacting people from some of these Facebook pages and blogs, and then from there, people would introduce me to other people. I would go to events and meet more people, and it just sort of snowballed in that way, to the point where in March I was at I can't remember if it was a book presentation or a film screening, and one of my friends joked that, anytime that there's some kind of Black themed event in Italy, I always manage to show up and be right there. So it's a very immersive experience.
And it kind of really reminds me of how interconnected we are. Like doing this talk, you're in Milan, I'm in Ottawa, and we probably have viewers from all over North America and South America. It's all amazing how we can all be connected and find each other through
Absolutely. And it totally changes the practice of field work as well. I mean, in the sense that in many ways, you're always connected to the field. There's a anthropologist, John L. Jackson's, his most recent book, Thin Description, kind of gets at this question of what it means to carry out ethnographic research in this moment when you were never fully removed from the field, when your interview subjects are themselves actively producing and sharing, they're conducting their own autoethnography, when, it's not as though you do research and go home and then years later the dissertation comes out, but that, actively as you develop your project, it's a constant dialogue between the people you're doing research with. So it's fascinating.
And to sum up one last, I guess, to bring this presentation to a close, we are going to take the last question from Celeste on Twitter. You did mention before how your experience in the airport, about you having your Italian passport, and you were also talking about I don't know if it was your experience in the pool, but she asks, how does how large of a role does gender play into what it means to be Black in Italy. But I had also, to just add on top of that, I was thinking, as a researcher for yourself conducting your research, it must be so difficult being a woman, being mulatto, and trying to, I guess, whenever you come have an encounter, trying to convince them, yes, I'm Italian, so it can only imagine how difficult it must add to your research. But the question was,
Yeah.
okay, sorry.
Yeah, no, gender is absolutely central, which is why, you know, taking a feminist sort of approach to this project is really, you know, was really important. You know, like I said, even the ways that the crisis in Italy gets talked about, it's talked about as a crisis of social, not just of economic production, but a crisis of social reproduction, right? About producing Italians. You know, Italian birth rates are declining. Who will the next generation of Italians be? And so, you know, really in Italy, what you see is what Filomena Essed calls sort of gendered racism, where racism works through gender. And, you know, again, it's there are sort of two sides to this. You know, on the one hand, there's sort of criminalization or stereotyping of Black women in Italy as prostitutes, as sex workers. This is something that, you know, I've found, you know, as far back as the first research that I did on anti-trafficking law. And it's part of why, you know, one of the main sort of, you know, and I mentioned that Black women have really been at the forefront of this sort of emerging, if you want to call it, Black Italian movement. And one of, you know, a central practice of many of these Black Italian women is to, you know, change the representation of what it means to be a Black woman in Italy. So, you know, this could be through, you know, sharing stories of successful Black women, or, you know, sort of very like glamorous, elegant photos, you know, with, you know, like hair is on point, you know, impeccably dressed, you know, educational credentials and all of that, you know, about changing what it means to be a Black woman in Italy, to show that Black womanhood in Italy is cosmopolitan, educated, entrepreneurial, and, you know, sort of savvy, and you know, making a real economic contribution to society. On the other hand, and, you know, this relates to the point about sort of the violent intimacies that link Italianness and Blackness. There is a real fascination, fetishization of Black women and women of color in Italy, which means that in many ways, as sort of the figure of sort of the Black male is criminalized, in many ways the Black woman is exotified, either as in need of saving, or as sort of you know, a passive object in need of saving, or sort of a, you know, seductive object of temptation. And so, you know, you see that there are you know, often like mixed race models or Black models that will, you know, rise to prominence at particular moments. Actually, another kind of part of the story that I'm telling that I didn't talk about in my talk is actually the phenomenon of African American women who live in Italy, who came to Italy in the 70s and 80s to really escape racism in the US, and found incredible success in the Italian cultural industries, because as they've told me, and they've really put it in this word, there was a hunger for Black women in Italy that they were able to use to their advantage to establish these really amazing careers as designers and singers and models and actors. Yeah, it's very complicated, and I would say that there's this extra burden that's placed on Black women in Italy that I'm always attentive to. If I have time, I'll share a quick anecdote. There was, so the Sanremo song competition happened in Italy a few months ago, sort of a national song competition, and there was an entry from a Black Italian singer named Cecile, and she sang a song where the title was sort of the initials NEGRA, so you can, you know, spell that out for yourself. And in this video, she was nude and sort of rolling around in white sheets that were sort of, you know, obviously it was done to sort of highlight the contrast between her skin color and the sheets. And she sang this song, you know, where she's sort of chastising this lover who, will call her for kind of sexual romps, but when he sees her, he ignores her, and treats her badly. And, this this video, when it went live, it set off a firestorm in sort of the Black Italian community online, particularly with a lot of Black Italian women who were saying, whoa, 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 this does not represent me. They were deeply alarmed that, you know, as they were, you know, trying to sort of reclaim their representation, this woman created this video that sort of re-sexualizes them, and people found this really upsetting. Now, of course, then this raises all of these really complicated questions about the politics of respectability, right? And, you know, what is the space for Black women's sexuality in this attempt to sort of assert the legitimacy of Black Italian women? But you know, the response to that video, I think, really speaks to, you know, whether or not we agree with the critiques of that video. I still haven't worked out how I feel about that video. Whether or not we agree with the critiques, I think the responses to that say a lot about the specific challenges that Black women face in Italy and the gendered ways in which they must represent themselves, again, in these struggles for recognition.
I can just imagine the uproar. Well, thank you so much, Camilla. I really appreciate, on behalf of Mob Poly, you sharing your fieldwork with us. Thank you so much. It is 5:15 our time. It must be so much later for you.
11:15.
So I guess we'll leave it off here. For all of you still watching, thank you guys for watching. And hopefully next talk we can have you guys watching again. So thank you guys so much. And Camilla, I think I'm able to stop the panel. I have a couple of things to tell you once we're done. So, but we're done our broadcast for now.
Great.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Bye-bye.